Hi everybody. Hi! Have you seen Heated Rivalry? I have a question for you. Have you? And if you have or have not, have you seen the discussion about Canadian cinema being back? Oh, is this a new era of Canadian cinema? Well, no. I'm here to talk to you today about Canadian cinema and also talk to you about Heated Rivalry maybe, and why we're here and why people are getting excited about it now, and why there seems to be this push of, oh, things are about to change when they're not. So we're going to go through my film archive yet again, and we're going to talk about Canadian film history, but I'm also going to direct your attention to the comment section of this video. In the comment section of this video is a whole big giant historic deep dive that I've done on Canadian film, TV and film policy essentially, and why we're kind of screwed when it comes to developing our own film and television industry. So if you have more questions about that, of why Canada isn't really going anywhere, check that out. But let's just get started and dive right into the history. A lot of people know Canadian film as from the National Film Board of Canada. I've mentioned it several different times, but what you may not have heard about is after about a year, our attorney informed us that we can never copyright or trademark multivision. It was too generic and it was a descriptive word. The words that you can use to copyright are Kleenex, Xerox, Coke. If the name is descriptive, so you can't trademark it, so you must make up a word. We were sitting at lunch one day in a Hungarian restaurant in Montreal and worked out the name on a placemat, of which we all wrote possible names we could think of. We kept working with the idea of maximum image until we turned it around and made it IMAX. Graham Ferguson, speaking on the origin of IMAX when interviewed by Take One magazine. So, IMAX, where did it start? Well, IMAX was created by four best friends. The first person on that list of these four best friends was Robert Kerr, Graham Ferguson, Bill Shaw, and Roman Croker. These four best friends changed the lives of 1,000 Canadian filmmakers and international filmmakers forever. These four best friends originated, most of them anyways, in a tiny Ontario town in Canada called Galt. Kerr, Bill, and Graham Ferguson all came from Galt, and Roman Croker came from Saskatchewan, but we're going to talk about where he met the crew later. Starting out in Galt, these three best friends worked on the student council of their high school together, and they were basically fast friends from day one of their very first steps of their first lives. And Galt now is called Cambridge, Ontario. So after high school goes by, these three best friends go their separate ways. Graham Ferguson ends up at the National Film Board of Canada. Robert Kerr ends up as the mayor of their town, Galt, and Bill Shaw ends up owning his dad's bicycle repair shop, also in Galt. So while Kerr and Bill are back in Galt doing their best lives, Graham Ferguson was at the National Film Board of Canada, and this is where he meets Roman Croker. Born on December 12, 1926 in Yukon, Saskatchewan, Quota would attend the University of Manitoba, earning a master's in philosophy and psychology in 1951. However, he would not inquire about the world of filmmaking until a friend introduced him to Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon, and from there, Croter's life would change pace. He would join the University's Film Society and created this short experimental film Bridge. Something about Deren's work transfixed him, and it sparked something inside him. And from that moment on, Roman Croter was hooked and pulled deeper into the lens of cinema. Roman Croter would be quickly accepted into as the summer intern for the National Film Board of Canada in Ottawa, and there he would continue full-time as a permanent staff member within Unit B after graduating from that program. The National Film Board's Unit B was one of the very number of units responsible for production at the Film Board between 1950 and until the abolishment of the unit system in 1964. Unit B was initially established to produce sponsored, scientific, cultural, and animated films with full-time and part-time staff of writers, producers, and directors. Unit B was a department known for bending and breaking the rules and out of films that dared to question the status quo. Under the supervision of Tom Daly and the filmmakers like Wolf Conan and Colin Lowe, Croter quickly rose through the ranks, arriving as an editor and then pushing his way into the director's chair. Croter seized his freedom to pioneer a style of documentary that broke with the practices that had become standard under the supervision of the board's original director, John Grierson. The Grierson documentaries produced during the Great War and also World War II affirmed the Canadian dominant ideology by keeping their messages clean and selling this country and how it wanted to be seen. Unit B's late 1950s and early 60s documentaries were more ambiguous and often critical of the relationship between documentary cinema and reality. Unit B's films were characterized by a heightened presence and engagement with their subjects. They were filled with early examples of documentary styles that would become known as direct cinema or cinema verite. Quota was at the center of Unit B when he arrived. He started pushing the filmmaking form and becoming a leading player of the unit. Some of his best works in the genre are films such as Lonely Boy from 1962 and his first film, Rescue Party. One of Quota's early short documentaries was Paul Tomaquet's A Street Railway Switchman, 1953. It features a man alone at night sweeping snow off the tracks in a freezing Winnipeg wind. He never looks at the camera, he never acknowledges its presence, but it's there and it's watching him like a shadow. Up until then, documentaries needed that connection, a subject looking into them, letting the audience know that they were looking back at them. Quota kind of flipped that on its head, and it was seen as a revolutionary style in narrative filmmaking. Then he also did Glenn Gould Off the Record, followed by On the Record in 1959, and later Stravinsky in 1965. Many of Quota's films are noticeable for rejecting dramatic form and expectations. He didn't care for clean arcs and tidy resolutions. The Living Machine in 1961 is a prime example. A chess game with the chessmaster Arthur Gladstone squaring off against an IBM computer. And there's a whole presence of Quota cutting in between the game and glimpses of a world slipping into the machine age, where computers aren't just tools but are challengers. As the match heats up and Gladstone begins to fret about the possibility that computers will win, Quota cuts to a science fiction aficionado who speaks of specific works of the genre that cast artificial intelligence as something to fear. And then the film wraps up with Gladstone beating the computer. Back to IMAX. So, Grant Ferguson and Roman Quota meet at the National Film Board of Canada. He does something called Lonely Boy, which is considered one of his best works. And he also works on a movie that I actually have right in front of me, City of Gold. So let me grab it really fast. So this is Roman Quota's City of Gold. City of Gold by Roman Quota is actually one of my favorite films that I can't... inside this film reel is this massive, massive film. It's broken. I don't think it's nitrate, but this film was made in the 1950s, and this film actually inspired the Ken Burns effect in filmmaking. Colin Lowe is sometimes described as a technological innovator in 3D technology and large format cinema and multi-screen projections. He pioneered documentary filmmaking at the National Film Board alongside Roman Quota and was a crusader for science and moral compasses within Canada's national identity in filmography. When Roman Quota was at the National Film Board of Canada, Lowe had already been working in the NFB's animation unit since 1950. Lowe and his fellow filmmakers at the NFB discovered a forgotten stash of over 20,000 photographs by studio and outdoor photographer Eric A. Hegg of the Klondike Gold Rush. Inspired by them to recreate the gold fever that had struck the territory, Lowe invited Quota to work alongside British mathematician Brian Salt to create a system whereby every image was rephotographed. Everything was carefully calculated. First, Lowe and the team meticulously framed the best parts of each photograph, then they plotted movement from frame to frame within the shot so that each of the movement worked as transition, developments, and changes of the subject or location successfully. Then the illusion that the world went on in all directions beyond the camera frame was always maintained while never showing the photograph's edges. The team also invented a gadget that enabled animation camera movement to be plotted live. This film was so successful technically that it won Best Short Film at the Cannes Film Festival and was nominated for a BAFTA and an Academy Award. The film's unique style of recreating history via archival photographs was a key influence on Ken Burns, who later said when he first saw City of Gold, a light bulb went off in me, and from there he would create in filmmaking, which is a panning and zooming effect on non-consecutive still images and video production. And that ended up being The City of Gold. And so this is a very special film in Canadian history because this is also a film that helps to inspire kind of the foundational physicists who would work with IMAX. There was a lot of mathematics that went into this film, and a lot of the people who worked on this film would work on future IMAX ventures at Expo 67 and 86, and they would really go in and assist IMAX with their kind of big Expo adventures, just because everybody met on this film. So, while Roman Quota is working on this, Grant Ferguson is also his life is exploding, and he's having a great time as well. He actually mostly goes to New York where he meets his first wife, and he does something I think called The Rooftops of New York, where it's another experimental documentary film. And then he continues to work with the NFB, where he befriends Roman Crowder, and I really want to stress how much these two were best friends. Roman Crowder and Graham Ferguson were so close that Roman Crowder actually married Graham Ferguson's sister and had 5 or 6 kids with her. And all of their kids ended up working at the National Film Board of Canada. So it turned into like a family. Let's dive back in. Where the hell did IMAX start? So IMAX was originally Graham Ferguson's idea. He was working for Expo 67 and on this film called Polar Life. And this is where he'd start to bring the gang together and trying to develop a really cool way of formatting this film. And he ended up working with Roman Crowder at the time to do the filmmaking, but then he realized he wanted to explore this 70 millimeter format more. And so he didn't really know who to call, but other than his high school best friends, Bill and Robert. What he ended up doing after they successfully worked on Polar Life is saying, hey man, saying to his group of friends, hey man, I really want to explore this new format of 70 millimeter, and I need to develop new cameras and new projectors and new formats to work with it, and I need not only, technical people, but I need businessmen. And so he approaches Robert Kerr and he says, hey man, can you stop being the mayor and come work for me and I'm head businessman of IMAX? And Robert Kerr goes, you're my best friend, anything for you. Then he goes to Bill Shaw and says, hey man, can you sell your family business and invest in IMAX? And Bill goes, absolutely man, you're my best friend. And that's what happens. The 4 of them come together and they form a crew, and legends start from there. IMAX doesn't fully take off actually until the foundations of Ontario Place, which we're going to talk about right now. For those who's not residing in Canada, it was the heart and cultural center of Toronto for a really long time. Was a place on the waterfront of Toronto where people would come together and families would enjoy, spending time in the water parks and environments there and just the general forestry of the area, but it was like a big social center of Toronto. That area of the city was starting to be developed and turned into Ontario Place. The designers were building this big giant dome, and they had nothing to put in this dome, and they ended up reaching out to IMAX, that were the team IMAX, who was developing their first motion picture cameras at the time, and saying, hey, you guys are looking for a dome-like environment to project your screens on, and we need something to go in this dome. Do you want to work together? And they said, yes. Because I'm absolutely livid at the Ontario government right now, I'm not going to make this too political, but I want everyone to fully understand the absolute destruction that has been caused on the waterfront of Toronto. To be clear, I'm going to tell you the specs, the engineering, and the absolute driven skill that was used to create the Cinesphere in Ontario Place. This is not just including the engineering that was took to make Ontario Place happen. This is just one particular area of this beautiful place that is no longer with us. Here is what the original Cinesphere dome specs of IMAX. Ontario Place was IMAX saving grace. Ferguson, Shaw, and Crowder were running out of options and time to demonstrate their projector after Expo 70 in Japan. The team knew they had to install their projection system in Canada or the United States to soon reach the North American film market, or their ventures would end. This pure chance of opportunity to work with Ontario Place came from Eb Zelder, a visionary architect who was designing the Cinesphere, and he needed something to put in this dome. No projector existed at that time to fill a 1,110-foot curved dome, but Zelder wasn't about to change his designs, so everything was at a standstill. Eb had become inspired after visiting Expo 67 to create a future recreational complexes that the public could enjoy regularly. But by pure dumb luck, Chris Chapman, an IMAX cinematographer, caught wind of Eb's plan and dilemmas and connected Ferguson and the team directly to Ontario Place. From there, they lobbied the Ontario Place hard to install the IMAX system, and their history would be made. At Ontario Place, just so we can understand how much of our legacy and history has been destroyed in Toronto, these are the original specifications of the IMAX Cinesphere dome. 3 theaters would open at Ontario Place, but none of them compared to the Cinesphere. The Cinesphere screen was a massive length and width, around 60 by 80 feet. The Cinesphere had a stereophonic sound system, over 2 dozen slide projectors, and 2 presentations which alternated weekly in the theater. The projector housed a 25,000 watt xenon bulb, a monster compared to the standard 6,500 watt xenon projector lamps that you get in your standard theater. This lamp was considered the highest powered light source ever used in a motion picture projection at the time. The lamp house was a modified solar system simulator developed for the United States Aerospace Program and adapted for Bill Shaw for IMAX. The lamp house would go under several redesigns in the following years, but it would eventually be able to run just on 10,000 watts. The xenon bulb that went into this lamp was about 19 inches long with a 5-inch spherical center. The bulb was made out of quartz to withstand its operating pressure of 8 to 10 atmospheres from the xenon gas inside of it. Face masks and protective clothing had to be worn on the bulbs for the bulb's inspection or replacement, so nobody died from xenon gas poisoning. The heat from the xenon bulb was so intense that the heat had to be dissipated through a cold mirror and coolant circulating through the lamps, electrodes, collector mirror, dowser, which is the light interrupter, and heat sink. The quartz mirror, which had 24 coatings of dielectric compounds, reflected 90% of the visible light while transmitting 90% of the infrared red light to a heat sink. Now we're just talking about the bulb here. The lamp house itself ran at a thevering 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, throwing off 85,000 BTUs, enough to warm a house in the dead of winter. Cooling the lamp was an ordeal. Cooling it required 15 gallons of distilled deionized water to be circulated through the lamp and other components at 12 gallons per minute. Water from Lake Ontario was run through a heat exchanger to maintain the coolant between temperatures limits of 80 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The original projector at the Cinesphere would be something of a spectacular oddity for most projectors at the time. The speed of which the film ran through the projectors was 24 frames per second, equaling 336 feet per minute. But what made it different was the frame size of the film passing through it, which is a massive 1.9 by 2.74 inches, and this was 3 times the size of most formats in 70mm. It was made for Ontario Place, and the film material was made under the name S-Star by Kodak. It was described as being virtually indestructible under regular use. Splices, if they did occur, were fused together by ultrasonic welding. But before a reel was even used, the film would undergo an exhausting 5,000 projector passes before being used by Kodak. The sound system behind the projector was boasted a 6-track stereo going through 5 speakers behind the screen, with the 6th track feeding the surround sound. Even the lens was custom made by Ernests Lens of Canada. This is an insane projector. Now, if you're wondering why the film had to be welded together, it's because of that xenon bulb lamp house. When you have something that hot and you have film next to something that hot, you can't have the film catching fire. So you have to make it super, super protected, and that's what S-Star by Kodak was, super protected film in the 70mm format that could be that close to something so hot and still survive, and still get a very high crisp projected image. But the feature presentation when Ontario Place opened and the Cinesphere opened was north of Superior. And we've talked about this as Graham Ferguson's first official IMAX film, and where he met his wife Phyllis Wilson, then later Phyllis Ferguson. It was a complicated affair. Filming north of Superior was a complicated process, and the IMAX at best camera, or the first iteration of it anyways, was a beast. It was heavy, it was stubborn, it was not exactly built for the rugged terrain of northern Ontario, but Graham Ferguson and his assistant Ronald Latour were determined to take it everywhere it needed to go. Another feature that would play at Ontario Place, which was the second IMAX feature ever made, was Volcano. This is the first instance of the IMAX camera starting its ill-gotten fate of almost getting wrecked and destroyed in almost every single production it's a part of. Christopher Chapman, who filmed Volcano on the small island of Heme, 10 miles off the coast of Iceland, followed the island's 5,000 inhabitants who were evacuated to the mainland and followed them confidently as they returned to rebuild their fishing village. When the volcano erupted, Ontario Place commissioned Chapman to film the scenes of the destruction, risking an IMAX camera in the process. During the filming, the lava got too close to the filmmakers, and part of the IMAX tripod camera burned, and the camera had to be quickly rescued. But Volcano was a hit, and audiences all over Toronto enjoyed it. I want to talk about Ontario Place very briefly. But this sitting in my hand is actually the distribution paperwork from 1994, I think, of IMAX. 95. But as you can see here, I was able to have all this distribution paperwork and also some really cool Ontario Place documents. So let's go through it together. This is Park 77's kind of welcome manual and brochure to Ontario Place. And I love it because when you go through it, you can see like it's just very, very Canadian. We got some very weird Canadian mascots of Canadian geese in here. We have something called the Children's Village that had a water park in it, the Forum, which is now considered Budweiser Stage, and I think it's being renamed. It was formerly Molson, and now it's being renamed something else. We also have a map of Ontario Place on the back. We have the pavilions that it describes. It's got a miniature golf experience, boutiques, places to eat and drink, the Cinesphere, of course, where IMAX was, and all these other fun activities that you could do at Ontario Place. Ontario Place unfortunately closed before I was born, so I never got to experience it, but it's one of those things where you're looking back in time and you're like, I really wish I was a part of that. So let's go over here. We have a press kit photo of Ontario Place. On the back of this, it reads, Toronto's Ontario Place. The Cinesphere predominates this aerial view of Ontario Place, which last year set a new attendance record for more than 3 million visitors. Situated in a tri-island setting on the shore of Lake Ontario, Toronto's newest fun spot is scheduled to open for the summer season on May 18th and remain in operation till September 3rd. And it also says Toronto's pride and joy, Ontario Place, a man-made cultural leisure isle. New Fun Centre continues to break its own tourist attendance records on Lake Ontario, and this photo was taken in 1974. If you know what's happening to Ontario Place, you know how heartbreaking this is, because it's being turned into a spa for rich people. This is another press kit photo of Ontario Place. It was just stunning. And now we're going to move on to IMAX. Now we have another press kit from May 6, 1996. Giant IMAX films make big move on mainstream. So this is actually where they start to really collaborate with Val Kilmer and Wings of Courage. So this was a IMAX 3D Avenger film. So it talks about the drawbacks of working with IMAX. At this time, there were still drawbacks to IMAX, as big movies, fast camera movements, and cutting images were impossible with those cameras at the time. Moviegoers' eyes, brains, and nervous systems couldn't handle the pressure. Movies are big, but the plots are wispy, so this one's already talking about, reviews of the film. They're being creative about it. Then we have some cool stuff of Bloomberg in February 6, 1996. Going public, they talk about that. Wellstern and Gelfond took IMAX public in June 1994 at its $13.5 a share. In the first year, they learned about the business, and the stock price reflected the volume of work that needed to be done. By February 3rd, 1995, the shares had fallen to a low of $6.05. Not great. So you can see here, there was things that needed to be done to fix that stock price. So here is a cool thing. This is where kind of James Cameron enters the picture. James Cameron often gets a lot of credit for working with Titanic first and, very much being involved in photographing Titanic. Here's where I want to talk about some conflicting history in the history of documenting the Titanic, okay? IMAX did it first. They recruited James Cameron to come down with them in that first initial adventure called, I think it was Journey to the Deep, that we're going to talk about. Oh, yes, no, it was Titanic. Everyone kind of forgets about Titanica, Journey to the Deep, and these other IMAX films that collaborated with James Cameron long before he did Titanic. And I think that's really important to point out, is that Titanic wouldn't have been possible if those collaborations hadn't happened first. We're going to talk more about Titanica later on, because I do have the press kit in front of me, and we'll talk about the achievements later on. But in 1995, the first IMAX format film showed at Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan, and then this, and 25 years later, and 120 IMAX specific theaters later, we get Titanica. And this was shown, I believe, in IMAX HD at 48 frames per second, high definition enhancement, and in IMAX 3D theaters in Chicago, San Francisco, and Costa Mesa, California. Also showed Titanica, Turnbull and Wiltshire loved this film. It was one of their favorites. And we're going to talk about Mr. Turnbull in a second, because you might be wondering who I'm talking about. Turnbull, I'm talking about the one and only Douglas Turnbull, who did 2001: A Space Odyssey. We'll circle back on him later, but he was an owner of IMAX for a little bit. This is the Spotlight featurette on Titanica. And we get more kind of IMAX Corporation builds production slates for large format films for 1995 and 1996 and these other press releases. Here's a really cool one that breaks down what the IMAX Dome technology looked like. Whoops. IMAX Dome technology looked like in IMAX 3D. So we have this official printout of all those different traits that went with this. So, and the asteroid adventure rides that went on the simulation rides that they did in IMAX HD, what IMAX Gelato was, how that was different, fun stuff. IMAX, you also, when you go to a movie theater, there's always a sound system, right? So they also wanted to develop a sound system that matched the visuals that you saw. And so this is one of those sound things. And this had this little ultimate 3D experience goggles. The effect of the IMAX personal sound environment system is created through a combination of unique recording techniques and our patented headset technology. The result is sound that seems to move in front, behind, and around the listener. So a listener actually feels as he and she is in the environment that they're hearing. And I have no idea what happened to this headset. I've never seen one online. I've never seen one on eBay. I don't know what happened to this technology, and I don't know the history of it. I just have that little binder. I need to look into it. We have more IMAX 3D things, more press releases talking about their stock prices. Any other cool things in here? Oh yes, the films in distribution in 1996. This is cool. So this is all of their entire catalog that they had leading up to this point and where they were being featured in the world. So this is really cool. I get to go through the movies and double check this with archives that actually exist online, and if there isn't any online, I kind of make a note of it and put it in my book somewhere. So yeah, I am very privileged that I have this information, and I'm very privileged that this person on eBay trusted me to give it to me. Let's move on to the other cool IMAX stuff. Alright, so let's move on. I have a lot of other IMAX films here like that we're not going to cover today, like Survival Islands, When They Go to the Arctic. There's also Into the Deep, which was another Graham Ferguson feature. He didn't work on all of the IMAX educational films, but towards the end of his life, he kind of stepped away from doing that. A really sad thing about the IMAX for the original IMAX people who founded IMAX is that Graham Ferguson, I think it was Roman Crowder or Bill Shaw who died first. I think about half of them died of heart attacks. And Graham Ferguson, he was the first man to start IMAX, and he was the last man to leave the group. He actually passed away in 2021, just before Ontario's place got destroyed by Doug Ford. His wife, Phyllis Ferguson, had passed away very suddenly of a heart attack, and about 6 weeks later, he passed away as well. At this point of his death, all of his friends and family of the original IMAX team had passed on, so he was kind of alone. So the next one I have here is China, where they were documenting the pandas. IMAX actually did a lot of documentaries and still does on a lot of animals, so this is one of them. We have Grand Canyon. Not a lot to talk about for this one either, it's just the Grand Canyon. Sorry for those fans of the Grand Canyon. Human Body. I actually remember this very vaguely of not being allowed to watch this one growing up. I think it was screened at the Ontario Science Centre, also destroyed by Doug Ford. And they had this huge exhibit of the human body, and I believe this IMAX film was also featured alongside that exhibit. Now we also have Destiny in Space. This one we are going to talk about. This is one of the other IMAX NASA collaborations that was done with NASA headquarters, a huge film advisory committee at NASA. I'm going to read some names here. If you recognize the names, give them a shout out and a pat on the back. Evan Berkeley from NASA headquarters, Stephen Chodek, Michael Collins, Gwen Kreider, Professor Frank Davidson, Dr. Leonard Frisk, William D. Green, Martin Harwitt, just to name a few. There's way more. Destiny in Space was the third large format film by the same team that brought you The Dream is Alive and Blue Planet. Destiny in Space is presented by the Smithsonian's Institution of National Air and Space Museum and Lockheed Martin Corporation in cooperation with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Graham Ferguson bio and Toni Myers, once again, she was the writer and editor on this one. She did a lot of really cool stuff. She actually got indicted both, I think the entire IMAX team has won the Order of Canada, including Toni, for their work with IMAX. Here's some more stats for the production notes. For Destiny in Space, says producer Graham Ferguson, we were able to fly the IMAX camera away from the space shuttle on another spacecraft, the German-built satellite Orpheus, and take pictures of the shuttle itself. The footage is astonishing, and it's something nobody has ever seen before. Hundreds of people were involved in getting this spectacular footage possible. It required a coordination between 2 NASA centers, the orbiter, the flight crew, and at least 2 data relay satellites, to say nothing of the satellite which was used for the remote camera. It involved 2 spacecraft, one of them unmanned, flying in formation at 160 nautical miles above Earth at 7,500 miles per hour. Once Orpheus was released, the maneuvers involved flying away from the satellite had to occur exactly on time with absolute precision, and the pilot had to ensure that Discovery was in the field of view of the satellite, and the satellite itself was pointing in the proper direction so that the remote camera would see the orbiter. And all this needed to happen during a daylight pass, while the shuttle was in sunlight, which only lasts for about 45 minutes per orbit. Needless to say, there were a few tense moments at the control center. Filming was an unqualified success with no fluke. Months of planning and preparation went into this, as any other spaceflight, and for the astronauts' role as cinematographers in outer space, they had to learn all their new skills. So once again, they were trained to be filmmakers. And each flight was simulated as one of the payload support teams. The payload support teams would sit on all these training sessions. Oh yes, Myers also helped design the shuttle's bay camera. So they had the IMAX camera not on this remote satellite, but also in the shuttle bay itself. So when the doors open, they release satellites. You could see everything inside the space shuttle, which was really, really cool. Myers worked under the guidance of astrophysicist and former director of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, Dr. Martin Harwitt, and a team of scientific experts selected by the museum. And it was them who were responsible for the scientific accuracy of the film. And we can go through here. We have so it took more than a couple of space shuttle missions to get this done, and this is the entire list of them. Leonard Nimoy was the narrator of this film as well. Oh yes, so here's our quick fact stats. Number of astronauts involved in filming Destiny in Space was 43. Number of rolls of film shot in the shuttle missions was 44. Number of hours of IMAX camera training per astronaut was 25 on average. And the total cost to make this film was $10 million US. So that's not bad.
My next film that I'm going to talk about is IMAX's Space Station. This is one of my favorite films that's ever been made in IMAX, and I'm going to get emotional when I talk about this, because this is it came right after they had made The Dream is Alive, which was their first collaboration with NASA. And a really cool fun fact about NASA's collaboration with IMAX, it would have never been possible without Phyllis Ferguson, Graham Ferguson's wife, second wife. Phyllis Ferguson was somewhat of an anomaly on the IMAX team. She had met Graham Ferguson when he was still married and had a child with his first wife when he was filming north of Superior in her native village. She was on a First Nations reserve, and thank God for this, but she was not picked up in the 60s Scoop, which is a section of history in Canadian history that we still struggle with today, where the natives were basically kidnapped and forced to be assimilated into white culture. And for some reason, she survived, even though it was a miracle that she did. Her original birth mother did not want her, so she gave her up to her grandmother, and her grandmother raised 30 kids, I believe 30 or 8, like a huge number of children besides Phyllis, and got them a roof over their head, made sure they were okay, and made sure that they stayed with their First Nations people. That's where she met Graham Ferguson, and all of her friends were like, hey, don't date this man, he's married, and he has a kid, and he's 47, and you're just turned 20. Don't do it. But she did it. She was his mistress for a very long time before they ended up He ended up leaving his wife for her. She's the reason that NASA worked with IMAX, because when she was down with the IMAX team in Florida, Fort Lauderdale at the Kennedy Space Center, they were really trying to figure out something with NASA to really do a partnership, but NASA wasn't really wanting to work with an agency that was not American at the time. So what she ended up doing was breaking into Kennedy Space Center, buying the astronauts lunch every day, and saying eventually they agreed to work with IMAX. And history was made from there. So we really have to thank her for that. She was also a very independent filmmaker. She kept her career very separated from IMAX as well, because she knew that, it doesn't really look good if you're the wife of a famous filmmaker. You want your own career, you want your own legacy, and she did that successfully as well.
IMAX and NASA are now synonymous in circles of scientific centers and at the exhibition of scientific content. In the 1980s, a new era of innovation for the film industry and technology sectors were started to be created. New laws and new tax credits and developments in communication technologies were created everywhere in North America. For IMAX, the 1980s would see the launch of new intergalactic partnerships. IMAX skyrocketed into new worlds with The Dream is Alive 1985 and captured the magic and menace of space travel and told the story of NASA's space shuttle program. 37 minutes long, it was narrated by Walter Cronkite and directed by Graham Ferguson. On June 1st, 1985, the film The Dream is Alive would record the launch of the space shuttle mission STS-41C. There were fantastic views of Earth from 448 kilometers high, eerie shots of weightlessness, sleeping astronauts, and amusing scenes of them eating food that threatened to float away. And also a thrilling pilot's eye view of a high-speed space shuttle landing. Featured in the film was Canada's own Marc Garneau, the first Canadian ever to travel in space, and Lockheed Corp bankrolled the film at $3.6 million in production. The Dream is Alive included scenes from numerous space shuttle missions, beginning with the Discovery landing at Kennedy Space Center, shuttle landing facility upon the conclusion of STS-51A, and the opening sequence comprised footage from Discovery's landing, radio transmissions from Challenger's 1984 landing on STS-41B, and footage filmed from a fixed-wing aircraft. Mission STS-41C, the 11th mission for the Space Shuttle program, was featured the most heavily, beginning with the deployment of the Long Duration Exposure Facility, or LDEF satellite. Other STS-41C mission activities included a student experiment on a mid-level locker to determine how honeybees make honeycomb shells in a microgravity environment. The film itself was produced and shot 15 to 18 months before the January 28, 1986 Challenger disaster, included appearances by two astronauts who died in the explosion, Francis Scobie and Judith Resnick. The Challenger itself was featured prominently in the film. Many of the themes and tones of the documentary regarded the normalization of space travel to space using the shuttle, while only mentioning the dangers and presenting the journey as a secure and riskless way to travel. The Challenger disaster would dramatically curtail this belief in later films. Despite the tragedy, the film soared to new heights, and by 1992, Variety reported $70 million in earnings on this educational, translating to $17 million in film rentals in the United States and Canada, making it the highest-grossing IMAX film ever at the time. It played at the Smithsonian 10 times daily, traveling North America and beyond. After the film's release, the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum would air the film 10 times daily, and the film would travel to Canada to be featured at Ontario Place and the Edmonton Space Science Centre in Alberta. Other prints were designed for IMAX and OmniMax theaters in 16 other cities in North America, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. IMAX President Graham Ferguson said at the time that between 1/4 and 1/5 of all the footage captured by the astronauts in space was used in the movie, which is an incredibly small amount. But The Dream is Alive would become the first documentary shot in outer space. Following their first intergalactic Earth trip, following The Dream is Alive, the IMAX crew would also create the first IMAX 3D film, We Are Born of Stars, which debuted in IMAX Dome Theater in the Tubaska World Fair in 1985 in Japan, written and produced by Quota in Anaglyph 3D, something that I'm butchering saying, is a stereoscopic 3D effect achieved by encoding each eye's image using filter or different, usually chromatically opposite colors, typically red and cyan colors together. The film used computer-generated animation to tell the story of humans' life's evolution from the earliest molecular level to its present-day complexity. Nelson Max, a computer imagery specialist at Livermore Labs in California, designed the remarkable imagery. 3D filmmaking for an IMAX dome screen was exceedingly complicated, but by all accounts for the screen's curvature and added high level of intricacy to the film's geometry, this was an incredible challenge unto itself. Because of this, Nelson Max's specialty in computer imaging and mathematics was invaluable to the production. In addition to his work on We Were Born Stars, Nelson Max collaborated on several subsequent IMAX projects, including Echoes of the Sun 1990.
Now we're going to talk about Space Station. Space Station was done by a lovely woman who is my personal hero, and her name is Toni Myers. Toni was no longer with us. She died in 2019 of cancer. And Toni was Graham Ferguson's editor on North His Superior, so that's where they met. So she ended up being his editor. And from there, she ended up being a director working with IMAX. And she would also be a producer on several films. She was also the first woman to ever narrate a documentary.
Clocking in at 47 minutes and 6 seconds and released on April 19, 2002, Space Station would be the next NASA IMAX collaboration, which opened in over 90 IMAX theaters worldwide. Directed and produced by Toni Myers, it wasn't just another IMAX documentary. It was the first 3D film shot in space narrated by Tom Cruise. Space Station was documented the STS-92 Space Shuttle Discovery mission, October 11th to 24, 2000, during the 13-day flight and its 4 spacewalks to configure parts of the ISS. For NASA, this wasn't just a mission, it was the beginning of something bigger, a global alliance of 16 nations working together to build a permanent foothold in outer space. 408 kilometers away to study the effects of long-duration exposure to zero gravity and the necessary first step toward the global effort of placing humankind on Mars. Between December 1998 and July 2001, more than 98 feet or 13 miles of 35mm film flew into space for filming. As the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, progressed with the first construction phase of the International Space Station, the organization realized they had a perfect opportunity to document the construction and the perfect long-term filmmakers for over 20 years to do it. There was very little question about which filmmaker they were going to choose for this project, which was a key IMAX space team member, Toni Myers. And she was the most well-known, well-versed editors and directors for the IMAX and previous space films and space programs to take on the job. Myers wrote and edited the space films The Dream is Alive, Blue Planet, Destiny in Space, and served as the producer, writer, director of L5 for City in Space and Mission to Mars in 1997. Her pick for director of photography would be James Neilhouse, and who would also become the astronaut training supervisor. This incredible IMAX feat relied heavily on the crew members' previous experience with NASA and Lockheed Martin. Space Station was about to test the latest and greatest IMAX camera technology, and extreme environmental factors had to be considered. With excessive communication between both organizations, the film crew consulted with astronauts, mission specialists, scientists, astronauts who had put on many aspects from handle design to control knob placement. The filmmakers and camera designers who had never physically shot a film in space relied heavily upon the panel of advisors of people who had been to space. Certain weight limitations and factors were also crucial in designing the new cameras. The certain cameras had to be compressed to a lightweight and smaller size than traditional IMAX devices, which mean less room for electronics. Many electronics used in IMAX characters, such as computer chips, were very susceptible to the cosmic and solar radiation in orbit. Other related concerns once filming began aboard the ISS were down to Myers and her colleagues, who had been told that if left aboard the IMAX station for more than 16 days, the 65mm film negative would become fogged by the same cosmic and solar radiation that could affect their computer chips. If something went wrong up there, there would be no second takes. So film delivery and pickup had to be coordinated with the space shuttle flights, which remained docked at the space station for almost 10 to 12 days. In addition to massive camera redesign work, hundreds of man-hours were devoted into training these astronauts and cosmonauts working above the space station, as their jobs would double as cameramen, cinematographers, and sound and lighting engineers during the filming sessions. Neil House drilled them in every single thing in camera, technology, and education, with crash course in filmmaking taught between survival training and mission prep. Basic filmography training had to be given to the astronauts in addition to their scientific training for specific missions. These lessons range from teaching the space travelers to be cautious of the space between the lenses and the distance between the subject and the lens and the quality they could achieve with their final images, and IMAX filming techniques by screening some of the company's previous films. The IMAX filmmakers also talked about rudimentary filming techniques and gave hands-on demonstrations of the hardware involved in the shooting. This was made all the more difficult because the new IMAX camera for the mission had not been completed in time for the mission training. And also, if you're wondering how the IMAX cameras evolved over time, it's specifically due to how they collaborated with NASA on these films, because NASA gave them the budget to develop a smaller and lighter and easier to work with camera because they were sending things into space versus actually going through the traditional Hollywood route. The entire film averaged about 22 hours over the months preceding each crew's mission. The film training continued until the astronauts entered quarantine 1 week before launch, and last-minute sessions were held to practice magazine loading and unloading, while Myers worked with crews to develop and hone a list of scenes she'd hoped would be shot. Scheduling filming while above and on the ISS was challenging, but the crew took their filming assignments seriously and fully committed to them. Nervous that the crew and astronauts would forget their specific training before launch, one of the most impressive things Tony Myers ever did was operate in guerrilla mode while shooting cosmonauts launching off of the rocket pads in Kazakhstan. Shooting in Kazakhstan presented unprecedented filmmaking challenges, as Kazakhstan had limited filmmaking resources and still does today. So the IMAX team had to double the equipment in case of what they chose to travel with each time they shot a rocket launch. Some of their items included 15,000 meters of telephone wire in case their cameras required a hardware restart. Space Station 3D also received incredibly positive reviews. Oh yes, I haven't mentioned, this is my co-assistant today. Suzy is not with us right now, she's sleeping. Over here is little Snowy. Snowy is my oldest kitty cat. I've had her since I was a teenager. She came to us from the Humane Society, so she's gonna sit over there. She's really old. My little girl's 13 this year. But let's get back to IMAX. We're gonna take a little tangent because I want to talk about the man, the myth, the absolute legendary unit that was Douglas Turnbull. Douglas Turnbull ended up as one of the owners of IMAX in the late 90s, as we've been talking about, and he did 2001: A Space Odyssey. You're looking at me like, what the hell is this? This is one of the photo press kits of 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm very happy that I own this. So it kind of talks about everyone who contributed to the project. Enjoyed working together so much at the National Film Board that when Stanley Kubrick came knocking, offering Colin Lowe a ticket to the stars on 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968, Lowe turned him down. 2001: A Space Odyssey was a film that changed the entire direction of visual effects and animation in filmmaking, not to mention science fiction forever. The reason Stanley Kubrick had approached Colin Lowe and also Roman Crowder to come work for him on 2001: A Space Odyssey is because he saw a little Canadian film called Universe, 1960, that was co-directed by Colin Lowe and his partner in crime, Roman Crowder. It was a film so realistic that NASA made it required viewing for astronauts. Clocking at 27 minutes, Universe painted the cosmos with matte paintings, miniatures, footage from the University of Toronto's observatory, and this film is often compared to a precursor to Carl Sagan's Cosmo TV series. The film's opening soundtrack is virtually identical to the legendary thudding drum beats and the camera angles from 2001: A Space Odyssey. The moon surface featured in the movie is one of the most spectacular miniatures ever produced at the NFB. During Stanley Kubrick's careful crafting of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kubrick called upon Harry Lange, a NASA concept artist and designer who knew rocketry and worked with Wernher von Braun. While working alongside NASA and preparing for this shoot, Kubrick attempted to view every science fiction movie possible, incorporating visual effects. Amongst the films that impressed him the most was Universe, so he reached out first to Wally Gentleman, the man behind the special photographic effects, and then to Colin Lowe himself. He wanted to know their secrets, and he wanted to bring their expertise to 2001. So instead of saying no, Colin Lowe would also say he didn't want to work necessarily for Hollywood. He wanted to stay at the NFB, but he continued to advise Stanley Kubrick whenever he had a question about special effects that he could do for the production. Wally Gentleman himself would actually go down and work on 2000: Space Odyssey for a little bit, but overall just get overwhelmed by Stanley Kubrick's personality and leave the production halfway through. As quoted by Wally, "The hours were terrible. Every day we'd start at 8 in the morning and work till 10 in the evening. Then at 2 in the morning there'd be a phone call, 'Hey Wally, I got a great idea.' And then that gets a bit dreary after a while. I enjoyed Kubrick, the man, very much. The experience with him was vital and interesting, but I learned that one doesn't work with Kubrick. One only works for him, and I found that rather difficult. As a filmmaker, he was a little paranoid and certainly obsessive. He surrounded himself with really good people and dissipated their talents. Eventually, I got fed up with the autocratic methods being applied, and often seemingly arbitrarily, and at a variance to the useful application of the associated talent. After a year and 3 months, I finally reached the point where I had enough and decided it wasn't worth it anymore, so I left. After Gentleman's departure, Douglas Turnbull took responsibility for the effects work. We also need to mention, Universe not only helped inspire the special effects of 2001: A Space Odyssey, but it gave Stanley Kubrick the greatest voice of the entire. The National Film Board's gift to Kubrick was the voice of HAL 9000. The narrator of Kubrick's favorite Universe was Douglas Rain. Kubrick caught wind of him after watching Universe and knew right away that this was the person he needed to voice the renegade AI. From there, he summoned Rain to his office in California and sat him down in his studio to record the iconic voice. Rain passed away from natural causes on November 11th, 2018.
It will take immense courage to journey to this place, for on this pitted and pocked ball of pumice and stone, there is no atmosphere, 240 degrees below zero.
Douglas Turnbull, the reason he is considered the most legendary visual effects supervisor of all time, and nobody will ever beat him, is that he didn't just do 2001: Space Odyssey. He did Star Trek: The Motion Picture. He did pretty much any sci-fi movie that you saw in like the 80s, 70s, and 60s in terms of visual effects work. He was the guy to turn to if you did not have a solution on set. The other thing that makes this man so legendary is he was also responsible for the first flight simulator to ever be created, which was located at the base of the CN Tower in 1986. And because of Douglas Turnbull, the Toronto visual effects industry would not be what it is today, because that flight simulator had 3 people who were hired to work on it, creating the graphics, and those 3 people were James Snelling, Don Allen, and Chris Wallace, who would end up forming Topics, which is where Mr. X came out of, Core Digital Pictures, Gamma, and a bunch of other studios. So we owe it to Douglas Turnbull to really respect his legacy. We also shot that man after he died, not once, but twice into outer space. So we might actually do it again, because basically what happens is that we've been trying to get all the ashes of all the dead people who work on Star Trek and shoot them into space for all eternity. So this man is in outer space with Gene Roddenberry and the other cast members of Star Trek who are no longer with us. I think, honestly, we should send every visual effects supervisor out on a rocket ship at the end of their life. I feel like when you reach that status of being a world-famous VFX supervisor or director, we just shoot you on a rocket into space and call it a day. And if it blows up, you're a bad supervisor. Let's talk about actually one of my cool things. I used to have more of these, but I actually have a film cell of Interstellar. Is Christopher Nolan's work. He's done a lot of partnerships with IMAX, the Film and IMAX program. Interstellar was basically, as I like to put it, please don't get mad at me, but Interstellar was Christopher Nolan's way of saying, I want to remake 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then the ghost of Stanley Kubrick said, over my dead body, rose up from the grave and knocked on his door one night, so we got Interstellar. That is how I believe the origin story of that movie happens. But Christopher Nolan became a legendary IMAX director in the process, so we love him. Now, we've just started talking about Christopher Nolan doing Interstellar, but I want to backtrack to why he started working with IMAX in the first place. Christopher Nolan really, truly was the breakthrough on the horizon for IMAX in entering the Hollywood landscape of filmmaking. Nolan first fell under the spell of IMAX as a teenager after watching documentaries at the Chicago Museum of Scientists' 5-story wraparound dome theater. The images, the massive, overwhelming scientific images, burned themselves into his brain, and after that he became determined that he absolutely adored the IMAX format. However, it really wouldn't be until his release of Batman Begins in 2005 that his career would skyrocket and his partnership with IMAX would start to unfold. Fascinated with the projection and immersive experience, he leaped at the opportunity to involve the organization in some of his first Hollywood features. In January 2003, Christopher Nolan was hired by Warner Brothers to direct, at that time, an untitled Batman film. And Batman Begins would later become his official title, and it would start filming in March 2004 on Iceland's frigid expanse in the Verknechonol ice glacier. I'm pronouncing all of this horribly, I'm so sorry. Initially, Walter C. Pfizer, Batman Begins director of photography, used Artiflex 435 cameras and Bell & Howell IMO cameras and a Panavision Panaflex Millennium XL camera and a Panavision Panaflex Platinum camera to film every single sequence in the entire film. Visual effects co-supervisor Dan Glass and Janik Sirs, who were also on set, realized they would tackle what Glass described as the ultimate visual effects challenge, fitting visual effects shots into very real and very recognizable reality rather than a more fantastic world. So while the visual effects was trying to get finessed into the world of Batman, IMAX came along, and IMAX wouldn't really get involved until late into the production process. David Kelly, a 15 veteran of IMAX, was the first person to assist Nolan in integrating his first IMAX collaboration in Batman Begins. The plan was for IMAX to do this in a series of high-resolution tests into the IMAX format on the footage for the film's release in IMAX theaters when the film was released in June 15, 2005. During the DRMP conversion for the IMAX release, the result was a test of 3 minutes of footage in 6K, and so the standard IMAX up conversion at the time, 4K. And the film, of course, was a resounding success, opening in over 3,000 theaters in the United States and Canada, including 55 IMAX theaters. And because it was such a success, Nolan decided to partner with IMAX more, and this was the start of something outstanding. Now let's actually get into some more IMAX lore and away from the tangent stories. So, what should go first? Okay, let's do Titanica. Titanica, as I said, was IMAX's attempt to document the Titanic, which they weren't very successful at. But it was one of my favorite productions because it works with somebody called Stephen Lowe, another famous person who worked on the National Film Board of Canada, and also worked on other IMAX format features called Hail Columbia, Skyward, and a bunch of other ones. This movie is so cool because they had to figure out how to put the IMAX film cameras in a submarine, send it to the bottom of the ocean, but also have basically the portal of and windows of that submarine be crystal clear all the time and have the IMAX camera pressed up against it so they could film the Titanic correctly. They also had to get big giant fill lights, like camera fill lights, at the bottom of the ocean to light it up so they could film the Titanic. Then they had to actually drive this submarine while filming an IMAX camera at the same time. Then they also had to do all this other logistical stuff just to really figure out how to make this film. And they did it so well. One of my favorite things about this production is the fill lights that I just mentioned. So if you're at the bottom of the ocean, there's no light. So it's hard to film down there regardless of what type of camera you have. But if you're working with an IMAX camera, because it has such a big lens, more light is needed to come in and, expose the image. This is a problem if there's no light at the bottom of the ocean, right? An even bigger problem. So they had to design these lights that could withstand the deep temperatures and ocean currents. Then they had to figure out a way to turn them on and off safely, because when you heat up big, giant, bright lights in cold ocean waters, they're generating heat, right? So if you shut them off, they can crack and explode, which then explodes the submarine right beside it. Kind of like an Ocean Gate situation. So they couldn't have Ocean Gate happen at the bottom of the sea. And they had to do these really cool engineering processes to cool the lights in an effective manner while also maintaining the fact that they would not explode right next to their filmmakers. The other cool thing about this production is that where they placed the IMAX camera in the submarine was the main portal in the front of the submarine. So they couldn't drive the submarine straight in a straight line. They had to drive it from the side using the side portholes because that's where the best angle of the camera could be. So they were driving the submarine sideways the entire time while filming this movie, which was nuts. Also, only 3 people could fit in that submarine besides the IMAX camera.
Yes, so we're gonna do a few more, and then we're gonna call it a day for IMAX. Let's move these over here. So once again, we have some, Girl and Mountain nature documentaries. They also did a lot of musical features. We mentioned IMAX did Rolling Stones at the Max. They also did one with NSYNC. I think there was a record broken here for NSYNC's collaboration with IMAX, but it was mostly just format band stuff. Film was conceived and financed in June 2000, shot in July, edited in August, and previewed to members of the GSTA in September, and mixed and printed in October. Yeah, not too much to talk about here. Oh, but we do need to talk about Everest. So, let's talk about Everest. So, IMAX's Everest coincided with one of the worst tragedies that ever happened on Mount Everest, where I think 18 people lost their lives, but also resulted in Team IMAX kind of helping save the day. There was a huge tragedy where there was a backlog on Everest, so people were just kind of staying too still on the mountain slope, and people started to freeze to death. And there was one survivor in particular in this tragedy. I'll try and pull up the details here. Basically, he was left for dead not once but twice on the mountain because he just wasn't moving. The Sherpas didn't think he was going to make it. He climbed back down twice saying, "Hey, you forgot me, bring me home." He just didn't want to die. And so IMAX ended up, all they had on them to help signal the helicopter to pick up the survivors of this tragedy was red Kool-Aid. So they ended up pouring this red Kool-Aid into an X formation for the helicopter to land and pick them up in the middle of a storm on Everest. And holy shoot, was it a good call there.
A story of ice, altitude, and ambition captured in IMAX film narrated by Irish actor Liam Neeson. Located in northwest Nepal, Everest is part of the Himalayan mountain range, which stretches 1,500 miles along the southern margin of Tibet, separating the peninsular India from the rest of Asia. The film laid bare the brutal ballet of climbing 29,000 feet to the summit of Mount Everest and the challenges faced during the ascent, such as avalanches, blizzards, freezing temperatures, and oxygen deprivation. Ed Vesters and director Dave "Red" Shears led the charge in directing this in what would become a spectacular educational film about Everest, but also a story of tragedy. The team helping film and direct these filmmakers included a Spanish climber named Arcelia Segura and Jamelin Tenzing Norway, the son of pioneering Sherpa mountaineer Tenzing Norway. Filming wasn't a weekend affair. It took over a year. Most of the footage was filmed in 1996, coinciding with the 1996 Mount Everest disaster, and the Everest team set out to climb the mountain via the classic South Col route, the same route used by Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norway in 1953. Dragging an IMAX camera up Mount Everest was madness and a burden. IMAX cameras are, as we might have mentioned by now, are very, very, very heavy. They're over 100 pounds, and dragging it up a mountain was insanity, especially one such environment which was considered the most dangerous terrain in the entire world. But the filmmakers managed it anyway. They lugged it over blizzards, over jagged ridges, and into the death zone of Mount Everest. Frustratingly, the climbers and filmmakers could not just proceed on a constant trip from the bottom of the top of Mount Everest. They needed to move slowly, climbing higher each day, but returning to base camp to sleep, taking time to acclimatize their bodies, and in the process acclimatize the camera and their equipment. In the process, the team would also need to return the necessary samples and scientific data to help the geologists better understand the mountain building process and the threat of earthquakes in Nepal and northern India. Although not shown in the film, the Everest team also assisted in the research of Professor Kip Hodges, an MIT geologist who had spent years on the geology of Everest regions. The team played a courier for him, gathering rock samples near the summit to help Hodges learn more about the region's geological architecture. Most of the structural geology of Mount Everest remains poorly known because of the upper elevations on the mass, where many of the most interesting geological structures occur, but they're also inaccessible to the general public. Filming the documentary would take a sharp turn on May 10, 1996, when over 23 people from 4 expeditions set out to summit Everest, and tragedy struck brutally. With so many people attempting to reach the summit, with the ascent being so slow and the climbers quickly becoming trapped in the mountain's death zone, people would start to lose their sanity through oxygen deprivation. The Everest expedition climbers were immediately drawn out of their reverie and filmmaking into action to help their fellow climbers. Aptly named the death zone, where oxygen is scarce and freezing, screeching up to 80 miles per hour winds, and posing a constant danger of hypothermia, one of the Everest's massive storm systems moved in from nowhere, swallowing the upper mountain as a whole and turning night into a blind, howling abyss in the midst of day, and trapping these climbers high on the mountain. The climbers on the mountain's highest reaches were blinded by the darkness and whipping snow and shivering in triple-digit negative temperatures. Confused and fatigued from the thin air and surrounded by a glacial wilderness of unyielding rock and ice, lost, shivering, and suffocating, they had nowhere to go but down. The Everest expedition got word of the emergency at Camp 2, where they had decided to wait it out for a different summit day due to the high winds on May 10th. David Breishers immediately began coordinating a rescue with the 10 other teams spread out on Everest, and a field hospital was established at Camp 2, commanding the services of a physician from another expedition. Oxygen and other supplies slowed away at the Everest team on the South Col and were made available for the rescue effort. One major obstacle remained: how would the helicopter find this group in extremely low visibility of 19,500 feet? And that's when Arkeli Segura had a flash of brilliance and saved the day by pouring a red X from a liter of Kool-Aid into the snow. David Breishers waved a helicopter down, and once the X was sighted, success and rescue began. The person that I mentioned that was left behind for dead multiple times on Everest, his name was Beck Weathers, and unfortunately for him, he was one of the severely frostbitten, beyond recognition, and barely alive survivors from one of the expeditions that were trying to make their way down Everest. Twice he was left to die in the face, and 5 Sherpas from the Everest exhibition also tried to assist him down the mountain, but each time they didn't think he was going to make it. He ended up scaling down the mountain himself and getting picked up by the IMAX team, thrown on this helicopter, and taken to safety. In the end, 8 climbers died.
So yes, at the exhibition, team recalls treacherous route and infamous tragedy on the way to the summit. The Everest team set out to climb the mountain via the classic South Col route, the same route used by Sir Edmund Hillary in 1953. Beginning at base camp, the route winds through the legendary Coombe Icefall, where steep, stark glacial landscapes, and the Coombe Icefall moves 3 to 4 feet a day, and the constant motion can be heard as splintering cracks and heart-stopping shudders. And so as they were climbing up to Camp 1, weather systems and emotions were changing. Things were getting pretty gruel after 10 days. They had established Camp 1 above the treacherous Coombe Icefall, Camp 2 in the midst of the lonely Western Valley, and Camp 3 on the ice slopes of the Loess Face, and Camp 4 on a desolate, freezing, wind-driven patch of ground just below the south summit. When tragedy struck, Everest expedition climbers were immediately drawn out of their reverie and helped their fellow climbers. On May 10th, 1996, more than 23 people from 4 expeditions set out to summit Mount Everest. With so many people on the mountain's steep slopes, the ascent was slow, too slow. As evening began to fall, the climbers were still hovering in the death zone. Arkeli Segura, with their unrelenting sweet tooth, saved the day by pouring a huge red X in the snow from a liter of Kool-Aid. And once the X was sighted, David Breishers waved the helicopter down, and everybody was rescued. Now we get to move on to Siegfried and Roy. I believe this did break another record for IMAX. I forget which one. So we're just going to do a little double check, but it did come with all these 35mm slides, which was really awesome. It was narrated by Anthony Hopkins. You have Mysteries of Egypt and Fantasia. We're going to take a little note here and talk about Fantasia, because Fantasia is the reason the film in IMAX program happened, and also filmmakers started working with IMAX.
So yes, Fantasia. Why is this important? Well, in the late 90s, IMAX suddenly realized that they had a problem. They needed clients. They needed more clients to get more revenue, and they needed to figure out where their cameras could be used. And Hollywood was still not really convinced that the IMAX format or the 70mm format was something they really wanted to pursue. So what IMAX decided to do was start basically remastering animated movies. The first being Fantasia. So they did Fantasia 2000, and history was made from there. Suddenly animations were coming out and being remastered in the 70mm format, and we ended up getting the film an IMAX program. So thank you, Fantasia, for saving IMAX. We have amazing caves. We have dolphins. Hey, I do want to take a footnote and talk about dolphins, because it wasn't just done, it was the same team that did Everest did dolphins, and they also partnership with the world's most successful documentary company called McGillivray Freeman Films, which I believe is still active in Hollywood today. We have elephants, and then we have L5 for City in Space. This one is one of these fully 3D IMAX films where it was a hypothetical of how can we visualize the most scientifically accurate city that could exist in outer space. This is about the city, the hypothetical city that could exist in outer space. We could still do this today if we wanted to. L5, The First City in Space, was first released in 1996. The same year, Cosmic Voyage was released. And the first film, L5, was the first in the next series that tested scientific theories about outer space. Set 100 years in the future, L5, First City in Space, followed a 7-year-old girl named Chico as she discovered the wonderful views of her city of which she lived with her father and her mother, from the self-contained farms and gardens to laboratories and factories, from schools to playgrounds, to a state-of-the-art docking bay for spaceships and probes. The film was a cooperative effort between representatives of the Tokyo Metropolitan Government and the IMAX Corporation. A partnership between the two organizations and a previous short film intended for Expo 90 in Japan led to the production of this feature. The film was designed to give our viewers a realistic glimpse of human beings living and working in a space city orbiting the Earth. The film combined incredible computer-generated imagery, data from NASA, and actual 15:70 space footage to create a visually compelling feature film about L5, the first working community in outer space. L5 wasn't just a name, it was also a place, which is real, at least in theory. It refers to a sweet spot in the moon's orbit, balanced just right, that would theoretically be the best stable position on the moon's orbit at an equal distance from Earth, an ideal location for a port city because there's almost no gravitational pull. The perfect place for a city floating between worlds where only ships could easily slip in and out, barely expending a drop of fuel. L5 was a gamble for IMAX. The film was the first use of the filmmaking medium to create a reality-based film set in the future based on scientific facts. It was the first film to realistically depict a future city within our solar system based on actual data from NASA and leading scientists. All of the shots in space stations, the scenes of Mars, Eclinatus, and the comet featured in the film were the product of a complex combination of scientific data, technology talents, and imagination emanating from Ex Machina in Paris, Jet Propulsion Laboratories JPL in Pasadena, Fujitsu, and Image Corporation in Tokyo. The city L5 is based off of was on the work of several scientists, including the futurist Gerald O'Neill, and O'Neill's designs originated from his speculations on how people could survive and flourish in space cities with self-contained ecosystems underneath the long-term influence of rotation-induced gravity. Tony Myers and co-producer Graham Ferguson also approached Pat Rawlings, a NASA artist and aerospace designer and portrayer of the future, to assist in concept art for these designs. Said Rawlings, "This film enabled me to stretch my designs beyond the usual NASA future horizons up to 15 to 20 years. This sort of gloves-off, hard science fiction proves a glimpse of an optimistic future where the development of space isn't limited by government budgets, and instead the resources of the solar system have become a financial magnet, attracting thousands to the way stations of lunar space between Earth and Moon." Ex Machina, an award-winning French company based in Paris and Tokyo, produced several scenes that visualize the city, composed of more than 1 million polygons each, including a solar mirror array and a transport ships. Using imagery of Jupiter from JPL, Ex Machina also created holographic images that floated above the scientific workstations, and they also created a model of a comet flying through the solar system. Maury's aircraft, and the personal landing module, which Maury used to scout the surface of the comet. Their creations and renderings of the city stemmed from Rawlings' designs, which gave him an extreme sense of wonder and awe. Quoted saying, "My feelings upon seeing my lander, my EVA pod brought to life by the wizards at Ex Machina will only be surpassed when one of my concepts actually flies to space." Their process was precise and methodical. The Ex Machina team process began with video tests for basic camera and animation, followed by 3D and 35mm 3D tests. And the quality of these images would not be entirely determined until they were tested and seen on the IMAX 3D screen, especially for the stereoscopic elements and adjustments that needed to be made, which would change according to the audience's relative distance from the screen and the test screen size. But yeah, this is basically your blueprint as if we ever want to go in outer space and actually populate other worlds. Once again, also done by Tony Myers. We have one on helicopters. And finally, this is my favorite. This Cosmic Voyage. I've actually met some of the people who've worked on this film, who used to work with Tony, and they had just wonderful things to say about Team IMAX with Graham Ferguson and Tony, and how they, enjoyed just working with them and developing new technologies through film. And Cosmic Voyage was one of those things. Cosmic Voyage was actually nominated for an Academy Award. It didn't end up winning. Basically, it helped develop VR technology that could be used to place 3D objects in real time and real space, and also use that to visualize scientific concepts. It also, in the process, they had to found a separate visual effects and animation studio just to get this project done. Cosmic Voyage would take audiences on an awe-inspiring journey through the dimensions of our cosmos, highlighting the vast expanse of the universe, from quarks to galaxy clusters, using computer-generated imagery and state-of-the-art production tools. Under the command of director Bailey Sinek and producer Jeffrey Martin, the IMAX production would become an awe-inspiring testament to human curiosity and technological ingenuity. Cosmic Voyage set out to show humans where humans stand in the context of the greater universe, from the tiniest molecules to the largest galaxies and homegrown planets, and how they all fit together and relate to life on Earth. The inspiration came from Cosmic View, a book by Dutch educator Kes Broek that discussed the universe to its finest, tiniest components and most significant structures. Sillick, a Princeton graduate and veteran filmmaker, brought decades of experience to the project. Bailey Sillick graduated from Princeton University and was 28 years in the film industry and a veteran of it at this point in time of making Cosmic Voyage. A veteran IMAX filmmaker, Sillick produced and directed films such as Energy for the United States Pavilion in the 1982 World Fair, On the Wing for S.C. Johnson & Son, and 70mm 3D film Concierto for the Earth, produced for Expo 792. Our film's producer, Jeffrey Marvin, graduated from McMaster University in Canada and founded Jeffrey Marvin and Associates in 1989 after 4 years as a senior producer for Omnibus and Rebel Able Associates, Inc. of Toronto, Canada. He produced segments of computer-generated imagery for feature films such as Star Trek The Motion Picture, 1979, and for NBC, ABC News, and SPN. Bailey Sillick and Jeffrey Marvin were ecstatic to work together. The two had previously collaborated on Concierto for the Earth, produced for the Pavilion and the Environment at the 1992 World Fair in Seville, Spain, but they still needed more manpower for the team of researchers and designers who matched their backgrounds in film, science, and computer graphics. So the next few people they would hire to complement their skill sets was John Grauer, a visual effects mastermind whose resume included Tron and the groundbreaking CGI work at Robert Able and Associates, and also Donna Cox, a pioneer in scientific visualization, who joined as an associate producer, bringing with her her expertise honed at the National Center for Computing Applications at NCSA. The work on Cosmic Voyage would begin at Santa Barbara Studios, or SBS, in Santa Barbara, California, and the Creative Visualizations Unlimited in California. The technical challenges were staggering. At Santa Barbara Studios, the team needed to generate 15 minutes of high-quality computer animation translating into over 21,000 frames of IMAX 70mm film. Each frame consumed roughly 50 megabytes, which is huge for 1996, and required unprecedented processing power. Scientific consultants from Harvard, MIT, Cornell, Laboratory for Astrophysics and National Space and Air Administration and Museum, Center for the Theoretical Physics, Massachusetts Institute for Technology, and Martin Harrod, former director of the National Air and Space Museum, Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics and the University of California at Santa Cruz and Cornell University were brought in to ensure every visual was rooted in highly scientific astrophysical data. The film was the first to depict quarks, the fundamentally small building blocks of matter, and scientifically accurate simulations of the Big Bang and a travel through an accurate rendering of DNA strands. A Cray C90 computer was tasked with calculating the complex gravitational interactions for the film's galaxy collision sequences, consuming 950 hours of processing time. And the condensing galaxy simulation alone required 6 weeks around-the-clock computing on a silicon graphics-powered challenge and create models of key elements like the solar system, the Milky Way, and a galaxy, and more. And then Santa Barbara had to combine the state-of-the-art computer-generated images for the main feature of the film, the cosmic zoom. SBS, Santa Barbara Studios, Pixar Animation Studios, and NCSA worked together to achieve this. The cosmic zoom propelled the audience outwards past the unknown universe before diving inward to the atomic level, a dizzying plunge that defied the limits of human perception. This effect broke history as the most extended continuous computer-generated zoom ever created in the history of CGI filmmaking. Perhaps the most revolutionary tool to come of Cosmic Voyage was CAVE. CAVE stood for Cave Automatic Virtual Environment, and this immersive system was a precursor to modern VR. It allowed filmmakers to enter a three-dimensional universe, navigating the galaxies in real time. After the scientists modeled these segments into supercomputers, the astrophysical data was loaded into the CAVE TM, and the CAVE was a high-resolution stereo 3D video and audio environment where rear projection images of galaxies would hang in suspended space. Donna Cox and our colleague Robert Patterson choreographed these sequences with a newly developed CAVE software, which they described as a virtual director. Cosmic Voyage is actually based off of a book where it just shows you, a voyage from the Big Bang to now. What's really funny is that the National Film Board actually did a movie based on this book, the book that this movie is based off first, but it was not popular, so this happened instead. So there were live actions, not just CG sequences for this film. Live actions for this production were filmed on location in Greece, Italy, Holland, Hawaii, and Utah. Macro photography was done at Image Quest in England, while computer animation sequences were created by Santa Barbara Studios, the University of Illinois, National Center for Supercomputing Applications, and Pixar. So there was a lot of effort put into this film. This larger-than-life film format allows viewers to observe the stupendous events such as the explosion of the Big Bang and the collision of galaxies and development of our own solar system. And viewers will also experience a smaller universe that exists on the microscopic level by flying through a carbon atom and viewing quarks, the smallest known building blocks of matter. So the cosmic zoom that you see through this film is like one of the first of its kind to ever be done. So when you see, again, a movie where it's a CGI camera shot flying through the universe, zooming in on a planet, that had never been done before until this film. But I think that's it for me. This has been a collection of my entire IMAX archive. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something today. It's been really fun to kind of go through my archives and kind of revisit the appreciation that I have for IMAX. I've always really wanted to work for the IMAX or the NFB, putting that into the universe. But it's one of the joys that I have, that I end up with this information and also with the collection of information that you see in front of you. And it's been such an honor to even meet the IMAX teams that I have so far. And that's not even getting into half of the IMAX lore with Sandy and all their other 3D films that they explored during the early 2000s and 1990s. So I'll try and put some of that information in later videos, but I hope you enjoyed today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.